Welcome to the November 13th, 2023 Education Committee and Supplementary Regular Board Meeting of the Lower Merion Board of School Directors. This meeting is being live streamed and video recorded with sound for public broadcast. All participants joining via webinar will need to use the chat feature, which will be enabled during audience recognition. If you are attending this meeting in person, you should be aware that other attendees may be recording this meeting as permitted by the Sunshine Act. This means, however, that any remarks you make, even those made at your seat, may be recorded by other members of the public during the meeting. The board believes it's in its best interest and the best interest of the students to hear comments from district residents. An opportunity will be given later in the meeting for public comment, both in person and through the chat feature, which will be read by Ms. Buckman. The board strives to be respectful to all individuals making public comments and does not wish to limit any taxpayer or resident's right to free expression while making their public comment during the public comment period. However, attendees do need to be aware that intentionally disrupting a school board meeting is considered a criminal offense in Pennsylvania. So we have one thing on our agenda for this evening, and that is what is not so excitingly called a data presentation, but Dr. Yanni will.
Data presentation.
Okay, depending on who you are, it might be considered very exciting. But I look forward to Dr. Yanni's presentation on continuous improvement.
With a build-up like that, I mean, what could be better? In front of you, the board has something that looks like this. It's sample assessment items. As we go through the presentation tonight, I'm going to direct your attention so that you can actually see some of the items that kids actually work with on the PSSAs and Keystones. I'm calling this presentation our focus on continuous improvement. So as we talk about the data tonight, the presentation is going to be a blend of looking at how our students performed, and then also what we're doing as a result of our performance to improve outcomes for kids. As we go through this presentation tonight, you're going to notice that there isn't disaggregated data by building, and that's very purposeful because particularly at the elementary level, some of our subgroups of students are so small that if I were to put that data in your packet, we would be identifying students. But just so the board knows, we are looking at that data as a principal team and as a central office team. So even though you don't see it tonight, know that it's being worked on. And as we go through tonight, I want you to keep in mind a very important mantra. You don't have to be bad to get better. We're a good district. Our data looks good in many cases. That doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement moving forward. Sometimes people ask why we spend so much time focusing on PSSA and Keystone data. And that's really because that's the data that becomes public facing. It's what rating agencies use on the Future Ready PA Index. It's what the public sees. And it's what we're generally judged by from the Pennsylvania Department of Education as to how well or not well our students are performing. So tonight, you're going to hear a presentation about our state assessments. But if you look at that graphic throughout the year, we're going to be talking with the board and community about our local assessments, how our kids perform on a daily basis, our efforts around positive behavior, and then our efforts around belonging. So tonight, you're getting just one piece of the data that you'll see as we move through the year. Oh, okay. I thought you were that excited.
It's the buzz.
Okay. So tonight, you're going to see how our students performed in terms of achievement, but also how our students grew. So we all know that on the PSSAs and Keystone, there's 4 levels: advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic. But for every tested subject from grades 4 and above, we get a PVAS score. And PVAS is not another assessment, but it's a measure of growth. And what we've been doing is taking our achievement and our growth and then developing some theories of action to make sure that we are improving conditions for kids that are not getting over the finish line, that are not getting over the proficiency line, and then also for kids that making sure that every single student grows at least a year in a year's time. To do this work, we have to have several theories of action. And so typically when you think about theories of action, it's a series of if-then statements. I don't like the word if, because if implies that something might not happen. If you look at culture, I say, when we develop a culture where every single person believes that every kid can achieve at high levels, and we put the supports in place, that's when our kids are going to be successful. So there can't be deficit thinking in our district. There can't be a belief that some kids or certain kids can't perform. We need to approach every single day that every single student in our district can and will achieve at high levels. We need to make sure that our district is implementing a standards-based curricula. That means that all of our instruction has to be linked back to standards, but that the Pennsylvania standards or the Pennsylvania core standards are really the minimum expectations. That's not the bar. The standards are not the bar, the standards are the floor, all right? So we have to make sure that not only are we aligning to standards, but that we understand what the standards are in each grade level so that we can accelerate student learning and close achievement gaps. We also have to make sure that we're closing opportunity gaps. So especially when we talk about math tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about opportunity gaps. We have to make sure that we're assessing kids, and I know when we talk about assessment, we always think about paper and pencil tests, but really what we're talking about are these ongoing checks to make sure that students are learning what they should be learning so that teachers can adjust their instruction to make instruction as meaningful as we can for kids. And then making sure that we have a high quality staff evaluation process. Last week, we kicked off our first set of instructional rounds at Kinwood Elementary using Harvard's model for instructional rounds, where all of our instructional administrators, our academic council, visited a number of classrooms and then came back together and talked about what were the strengths that they noticed in terms of instruction and what were some areas of opportunity, some things that we could improve. And in a couple months, we'll do a presentation on instructional rounds and you'll be able to see how the work that we're doing through instructional rounds is going to inform what we're going to call our Lower Merion learning model, where we put together in one comprehensive document what it is that we believe about teaching and learning and assessment, and that will serve as the backbone for everything we do. Continuous improvement, it doesn't matter how well we do, there's always an opportunity to be better. So always have to have a focus on continuous improvement. Same thing about leadership. So we have to make sure that we have the best administrators possible in position, because just like kids can't be great if they don't have great instruction, teachers aren't going to grow, and they deserve everything that we can give them. But if we don't have great administrators in place, great instructional administrators in place, it's going to be really difficult for them to improve. We have to look at our resources and make sure that we are distributing our resources based upon how our students are performing. You know, some buildings have better performance than others, some buildings have different needs than others, and so we have to deploy our resources appropriately. And then also the piece about parent and guardian and community partnerships. We have to find ways and be very overt about allowing parents to know what's happening in our classroom, give them, you know, a bird's eye view so that they know what's happening in their child's classroom so that they can support the work that we're doing at school at home. So let's get into some of the numbers here. So what you will see is that year over year, we see slight improvement in our scores across math, English language arts, and in science. The pandemic year, 2020, there were no state assessments. So the state then, when we resumed assessments in 2021, PDE said use 2021 as your baseline year. And so you'll see there we have made improvement year over year. Here are some things we know. We know we outperformed the state. That's not a celebration. We should outperform the state. And we have to acknowledge that students' achievement happens not just because of what we do in school, but the whole totality of their experience. So what they experience outside of school. We live in an area with a lot of enrichment, a lot of great opportunities. So it's really the district with the students' complete experience that produces the results that we have. For the first time ever, the district had 95% of students taking the PSSAs. That has not happened before. So the higher percentage of assessments, the more reliable I think our scores are to look at where we need to do some work curricularly. We match some statewide trends. So there is something fundamentally wrong in our state, because when students first take the PSSA in math in third grade, they perform well. And by eighth grade, there are some subgroups of students that only 8% of students get over the proficiency line. So there's been a lot of advocacy over the years about changing that assessment. We don't see that level of drop over the years, but we see that our trends match the state. So when there's improvement across the state, we improve, and where there's regression, we regress a little bit. We just are now getting a look at other districts' data, and so what we'll be putting together for the board, we need to look at what I call our peer districts. So not necessarily districts of the same size, but the same SES, socioeconomic status, and relative stability of our student population. And so when you look at some of our peer districts, we're looking at Radnor, Unionville, Chadsford, we're looking at Downingtown area, we're looking at Mount Lebanon, Upper St. Clair. And so we'll be able to take a look at, we know we outpaced the state, how did we perform when we look at our peer districts? And we'll make sure that the board has that information within the next week or so. This is the first time I'm going to ask you to look at this packet. So what you see there before you is our aggregate data of how our students across subgroups performed in grades 3 through 8 in math. So a couple things that I want to point out. In grades 3, 4, 5, and 6, more than half of our students were in the advanced category. Our 8th graders had the highest scores they ever had, although the scores are still not what we would like to see. If you take a look at pages 2 and 3 in your booklet, you will see the cognitive demand that the assessment places on students. So a 4th grader who took the assessment last year would have gotten a question like this. So they have to look at a number of patterns, numerical patterns. They have to complete patterns, but more importantly, they actually have to explain their thinking. And so we need to make sure that in our classrooms, each and every day, kids are not only performing math correctly, they're actually able to make their thinking visible. And that's the piece that when students are taking the assessments, that is a piece that takes a long time to complete, and that is where sometimes our students fall down. They get the math correct, but they don't always explain their thinking well enough. If you look at pages 4 and 5, you'll see an 8th grade example. So in that 8th grade example, you'll see that there are a number of points on a coordinate plane, and then the questions ask about transformations, tessellations. Kids have to know about perimeter and area. And so even though on the surface, this doesn't look like a very complex problem, there are actually 8 concepts that students need to know and need to be able to interact with to get these questions correct. And again, there's a tremendous amount of explaining that kids have to do. So kids not only have to do well in performing the math, they then have to explain their thinking. So when you look at our data, you'll notice that we have some achievement gaps. Our Black and African American students do not perform as well, and there's a pretty significant achievement gap that we have to recognize exists, and then we have to work to improve it. How do we work to improve it? When we take a look at content and we take a look at our kids, anything we do to improve outcomes for kids, for any one of our subgroups, is naturally going to improve outcomes for our other subgroups. What do we have to do in math? Number one, we have to make sure that we are not locking kids in any math pathway. We have to give more kids access to more rigorous courses, because we know year over year over year, strictly remediation doesn't produce good outcomes for kids. We have to identify their strengths and teach to their strengths while also supporting their areas where they may have some gaps. So across the district, we're using the TIPS, Team Initiated Problem Solving form. That is an approved Tier 1 intervention from the What Works Clearinghouse, and this is where teams of teachers are becoming laser focused on what is the data telling us, what outcomes do we want to change, and how are we going to change the trajectory of our students. Conferring about assessment results is another thing that we need to ramp up in our district. Actually sitting with kids and helping them understand why they scored the way they did on an assessment. Helping them understand their mistakes and how they can avoid them in the future. Second chance learning as well. So if you don't learn something and you get a 70 on a test and you just move on without learning why you fell down where you fell down, real learning has not taken place. This is something I actually wish would have been the norm when I was in high school, because I was a kid who was math phobic. I would get my math assessment back, and as long as there was an A or a B, I was happy. But had I had the opportunity to sit with the teacher, talk about my mistakes, and actually go back and rework some of those problems, my learning would have been a lot better. And then our common assessments. We know that there are certain strands in math, fractions, operations with rational numbers, and geometric transformations that are consistently low. So what are we doing inside of our curriculum to assess students to see if they're getting that concept? And if they're not getting that concept, how are we reteaching that concept so that we can fundamentally change their trajectory? As a group, our students in grades 4 through 8 met the growth standard. So our kids are growing in math, but we need to accelerate their growth and accelerate their achievement. In English language arts, again, if we take a look at our subgroups, again, we're seeing that our Black and African American students are not performing as well as their Caucasian peers. Neither are historically underperforming students. And what we notice in the gap is not as wide between our subgroups in ELA as it is in math. Although our growth is not as good in ELA. You'll often hear me say that we need 100% of our kids reading on or above grade level by the end of grade 3. Because if we do not have kids reading on or above grade level by the end of grade 3 and reading on or above grade level for every year thereafter, we lose kids instructionally. But that means they have to read on grade level in kindergarten, first, and second grade. We can't wait till third grade. We need to look at our common assessments and how we are assessing their kids' ability to decode, to actually attack words, and comprehend. So the district did a good job last year implementing Foundations, which is a direct, explicit model for phonics instruction K1 and 2. It's producing good results. And what I'm confident in, by having a focus on improving our outcomes in ELA, getting kids reading more, getting better with giving assessments, and also making sure that students are reading all the time, not just during ELA, but that they're reading in math, they're reading in science, they're reading in social studies, we'll be able to accelerate how our students are performing. If you take a look at your assessment packet, looking at pages 6, 7, 8, and 9 is an example of what a fourth grader has to do on the PSSA. So if you think back to when we were in school, in middle school, we learned to write essays. And at that point, we were learning how to analyze and synthesize. Fourth graders, in this text-dependent analysis question, these fourth graders need to read 2 passages. So both of these passages are about the Everglades. And then they have to respond to a prompt. So it says, write an essay analyzing how the information in both passages support the author's statement that there are some things you do for the next generation. Kids have to use evidence from both passages. That's a really high-level skill for 8 and 9-year-olds because they have to take information from 2 different texts and put it together and not just restate it, but analyze what the author is saying. Our fourth graders last year, by and large, did an amazing job on the TDAs because that thinking that kids need to have in place to respond to a TDA, they write a TDA, text-dependent analysis, in fourth grade, but that thinking starts all the way back in kindergarten, thinking deeply about texts. If you look at the 8th grade example, so the picture of Minerva wove, and then the response. So this is only one passage in this example that kids need to respond to, but it's about theme. So how does the theme emerge? How does the author use text features? How does the author develop theme throughout the passage? Again, on the surface, it doesn't seem like a very complex task. Kids have to be able to not only read, but understand what happens in the text. They have to know what theme is, and they can't just tell what the theme is. They have to show the scorers that they actually know what theme is by using textual evidence. So again, things that kids did when we were in school much later, kids are doing much earlier now. We need to make sure that our literacy materials are requiring the same type of cognitive demand that kids are going to see on these assessments. Not because we're giving this assessment, but because this is good evidence of learning. So we have to make sure that what we're doing on a daily basis with kids gets them to this high level thinking. And again, because this is high level, sometimes people will say, kids can't do that. Kids can do that. We have to teach it, we have to model it, we have to practice it. And then we go to science. A couple things about science. You've probably heard before that the fourth grade science assessment is largely a reading assessment. The assessment, though, is also cumulative. It assesses science content that kids got in kindergarten, first, second, third, and fourth grade. So there's a lot of content it covers. 8th grade, it's much more science heavy, but it covers everything kids learned in 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So there's a tremendous amount of content that kids have to learn. Interestingly, our achievement gaps in science are far less than they are in math and ELA. Even though the readability of the science PSSA in many cases is more difficult than the math or the ELA assessment because of the technical terminology. What are we doing to improve outcomes? So we've added the STEM block for either 7th or 8th graders when it comes in their rotation. We've also started a STEM special at the elementary schools, and I have to tell you, I think most kids, if you ask them anymore what their favorite special is, it's the STEM special. I think part of that is because our STEM specialists at the elementary are so excited about what they're doing. And we're also looking at project-based learning, right? So how do we get kids actively putting their thinking to work. And in STEM, particularly in STEM special at the elementary level, it's very non-threatening, and kids are doing things that are really high level in their STEM special that they don't even realize that they're doing. If you look at your assessment, assessment packet, you'll see there is, kids have to, in fourth grade, they have to note some living and non-living things in this example. And then in eighth grade, they actually have to simulate, well, in their mind simulate a balloon rocket. So if you think about the way we teach, we want kids to be active. So if we're doing this balloon rocket, we're taking kids outside or we're taking them to a large group space and we're actually having them do it. To have to sit and think through this can be pretty difficult. So kids have to rationalize through what will happen and then respond to some questions. Again, really, really high level, which means we have to make sure that the cognitive demand of what we're doing in classrooms matches this, because this is what produces results. Moving on to the keystones, again, we outperform the Commonwealth. We need to look at growth, how our students grew in addition to their achievement. One of the things that you'll see as we look at the results briefly, we see that our students consistently far exceed the growth standard in the state for all three Keystone exams. Algebra 1, whenever they take it, biology, and English literature. Our Algebra 1 Keystones, I want to draw your attention to several things here. If you look at our students as a whole, we have about 77% of our students, the first time they take this assessment, they get over the proficiency line. If you take a look, though, at some of our subgroups of students, you see that the achievement gap widens a little bit. I think we really need to take a look at our math sequencing and make sure that we're exposing all kids to rigorous math courses, to make sure that in every math course that we're teaching, that we're stressing academic vocabulary and that we're really playing to students' strengths and not just looking at areas of deficit. If you look at the state average, there are some subgroups of students that barely have very few students get over the finish line. Interestingly, we have some students that take the Algebra 1 Keystone exam and are advanced or proficient, but are basic or below basic on the 8th grade math exam. Same kid, two assessments, widely different, vastly different scores. In your assessment packet, you'll see students have to wrestle through some equations and inequalities, and not only understand what inequalities are, but then actually use a subset of data and actually have to explain why certain coordinate pairs work and don't work. So it's really high level, and this is, of all the tasks that I put in here, this is a task that would probably be the one that would trip most students up, because it's really, it's not only a difficult concept, it's a difficult concept to explain, and kids have to do that in writing. English literature, again, our students perform fairly well. We're digging into some of our subgroups and some of our achievement gaps to see what we're doing to improve outcomes for kids. Again, if we are going to fundamentally change kids' trajectory, they need to be reading on or above grade level by 3rd grade. So we should be sending very, very few students out of elementary school with reading deficits. And kids that still have reading deficits in elementary school need to be getting very targeted, specific interventions to help them crack the code, because 95% of reading difficulties, it's not comprehension, it's actually decoding texts. And sometimes kids can read fine in English, but they go to science or social studies and they cannot attack those texts. And in biology, again, we exceed the growth standard. Biology is an area that the state has struggled with tremendously since the pandemic. Our students overall performed really well. And for those folks that might be watching the presentation, we went over a lot of this data in CCOB, the curriculum committee, so we're not going at a granular level. But one of the things that we're looking at inside our biology classes are taking a look at our common assessments and looking at trends over time. So are there things that kids are consistently struggling with, right? So as we think about our focus for continuous improvement in algebra, year over year, the trend is that we see kids struggling with inequalities and systems of inequalities. That means when we're teaching those units, we need to do strong pre-assessments. We have to make sure that we're checking for understanding during that unit. And if kids are still not getting it, we have to rethink how we're instructing it, or we have to do some targeted intervention. Because if kids don't understand inequalities and systems of inequalities in algebra or in their integrated math class, future math classes are going to be that much more difficult. In biology, cell growth and genetic inheritance is an area that needs to be improved. So that's going to be a unit that our teachers are going to focus on to see how they can improve instruction there. And then in English literature, the big umbrella is reading for meaning. And you might say, well, Steve, reading for meaning is everything. It's our kids are really good at comprehending at the high school level, you know, because we're talking about a high school assessment, understanding deeply some challenging concepts, but they're missing questions on recall details out of text. So they're not reading closely. The reason I have those three subjects grouped together for a focus on continuous improvement, we need to strengthen and continue to strengthen our PLCs. So our professional learning communities, when we're meeting, we're asking ourselves, what do we want all kids to know and be able to do? How will we know that they learned it? How do we respond when students don't learn what we want them to learn? And how are we extending that learning for kids that are already proficient? Across the secondary level, we need to be conferring about assessment results. It's that idea that, again, we're actually workshopping with kids where their mistakes were, why they made those mistakes, so that they understand their error patterns so that they can fix them in the future. Second chance learning, and then looking at common assessments. So making sure that we have a guaranteed experience across teachers and across classrooms and units. And then taking a look at our curriculum and making sure that our curriculum is tightly aligned to the standards. And that's something not just at the high school level. I've had the opportunity to stop in on multiple days when our curriculum team was working with groups of teachers and really looking at student data and looking at how much time we're spending on certain parts of the curriculum to see if we're stressing and putting stressing the importance of certain topics and making sure that kids are performing. Bottom line is we need to know every kid by name, strength, and need. So our district, we might have, over 8,000 kids, but each of our schools, each of our learning communities are of the size that we need to know kids by name, strength, and need. That means we need to know what their strengths are so that we can play to their strengths and attach new learning to their strengths. And then when kids are struggling, we can't wait for them to fail. Waiting to fail is not an option. So we need to intervene early to make sure that we don't set kids up for failure because they get into an instructional hole that they can't work themselves out of. This presentation, along with CCOB, the CCOB presentation that has a lot of data. We're working on a new part of our website, thanks to Ms. Buckman, called Making Practices Public. And we'll make sure that all of this information is there so that the community can see not only these global results and what we're doing for continuous improvement, but also all of our more granular data. What you will see over the next couple of years is I am confident that as we do instructional rounds and we develop our leadership team to become better and better and better at supporting teachers and recognizing good instruction, and that we're growing our teachers and we're growing our teacher leaders, I feel confident that we're going to see improvement. And you'll know next year when I do this presentation, because if not, you'll say, well, you promised improvement and you didn't get it. So, but I'm still going to promise it because it's going to happen. So, with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Yanni. Open up to Ms. Garrison.
Dr. Yanni, you alluded to this ever so briefly. A significant number of our students in Lower Merion receive a lot of enrichment and tutoring. Can we come up with a way to sort of level the playing field for those parents who do not have the financial wherewithal to pay for Kumon and Mathnasium and, $150 an hour for a private tutor? I know that you can get the practice PSSA. Are we letting parents and students know that these things are available to them and they could practice these things in the summer or holidays or whatever to try to bolster their scores? Because I don't think it's an issue of inability. I think that just not getting enough practice as other people are.
Sure. Let me answer that in a couple ways. So we can absolutely make some of these released items public so that parents can see the types of questions that kids are asked. There are some districts that opt to buy test prep materials and actually spend time doing that. I wouldn't see us doing that in our core courses. What I see us doing is integrating some of this stuff naturally into our good teaching and learning. But then also, there's some amazing things happening at Lunch and Learn and advisory and at Win Time. I think what we need to do is capture some of that really good practice and let other people see that really good practice. Because what I need at the elementary level is a time specifically for teachers to work in small groups with kids on areas of focus. Advisory and intervention and enrichment, again, and Lunch and Learn, those are times during the school day. So transportation isn't a barrier, missing something else isn't a barrier. So there are so many people that are using that time really, really well. I think we have to highlight that and make sure that more and more people are using that time really well, because that's a natural place where we can accelerate students' learning. Because I agree, I don't think some of our scores that I consider to be a concern are a lack of inability. I think it's just making sure that we're more intentional, exposing kids to the type of questions that they're going to be asked.
Yes, I agree. And I think also exposing the whole family so that the family can try to attack it together. Also, even though it's not in this report, I did mention this to you previously in reference to the PSA or people that practice SAT. It is not a practice SAT, and those who know the real value of it could take advantage of it because they've been practicing since 7th, 8th, and 9th grade before they had to actually take it. And some of the other people who are not scoring as well didn't know, I could potentially get a scholarship if I do well on this quote-unquote practice SAT, in addition to those who would be considered for the Merit Scholar. So again, I think we need to be more transparent about what some of these tests and assessments really are for.
And this will be a great section that we can add to making practices public. So Ms. Buckman will be very busy adding some things to the website. thank you for that.
Just so I was going to wait a little longer, but I just really wanted to get one question out that sort of piggybacks on what Ms. Garrison was talking about. And I want to know if we're teaching our kids skills for taking these tests. I'm not talking about teaching to the test. I'm talking about teaching how to take a test, because that is a real skill. Reading these questions, getting at what they're doing, learning how to pace your time, learning like what you're going to encounter so you're not freaking out, learning how to calm yourself down if you are freaking out. There's a lot of practical things, ways to prepare both emotionally and intellectually for the skill of taking a test. Because let's be real, these tests are skills. And one of the things that they are testing beyond the other things is how quickly our students can do this, if they can get it done in a specific time, which I won't complain too much, but I think a speed test for when we're trying to measure ability is bad test writing, but that's the end of my soapbox.
I think that's an opportunity for us to incorporate even more of that sort of metacognition for kids as themselves as test takers, right? Because the real world also has tests, although they might not be paper pencil tests. So we have to teach kids, just like we teach them how to study or we teach them how to take notes, there is merit in teaching them how to be a good assessment taker.
Absolutely. Like when you think about when you got this job, you had to do an interview. So when kids are in college, we teach them how to interview. This is a really parallel skill early in their education, and I think that there's some real merit in focusing some class time on that.
Thanks. I just wanted to take a moment to actually lift up the intentionality of how you disaggregated the data and the key takeaways that you've illustrated for all of us, and that might be helpful, and also based on the data is the least of our concerns. That the achievement gap data is actually showing, and the PVAS data is showing that we are not making the type of progress we need to for all of our students, or providing a tier 1 education that is foundational to MTSS and every other instructional approach in the district, and especially in alignment with the math continuum of how we are providing opportunities for our students. So I just wanted to thank you for pulling back the layers and taking steps to actually put some foundational best practices for instruction in place immediately in response to this data.
Thank you for that. What I'll say is it really is a team effort, because we've been talking all summer and to this point in the year that you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. So if we don't have good tier 1 instruction, it's like trying to build a house on sand. You can't do it. So it winds up falling apart. So the curriculum team, our principals, our teachers are really committed to it. And I think when we actually become more intentional, which we're being much more intentional, I think we can really change the trajectory of our kids. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Lee and Ms. Robinson are participating via phone, and I wanted to give Mr. Lee the opportunity to ask a question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just one quick note and one question. You had mentioned the 8th grade PSSA and how the scores tend to drop. One of the things to note is that the tests for each grade level, the PSSA, are not calibrated to be of the same level of difficulty. And it's been a few years since I looked at it, but there's a nationally normed assessment called the NWEA Math, and they did a crosswalk of their assessment to the PSSA a few years back. And they found that the 8th grade PSSA Math, just that one test, is unusually difficult, that you actually need to be at like the 83rd percentile nationally to be proficient on that exam. So just something to put additional context to the 8th grade specific course. You had mentioned that we're seeing some, for the kids that are taking algebra in 8th grade, that if they're taking they might be proficient on the algebra keystone, but then scoring basic or below basic on the 8th grade PSSA. At some point, we switched to integrated math, right? a few years back. Is that happening in 8th grade?
Dr. McGloin, integrated math?
It is, it depends on the students though. So we have students taking a couple different courses in 8th grade. So some students are taking integrated 2, some students are taking integrated 1, and then we also have a math 8th course. So there's 3 different offerings at that level, at that grade level.
Okay, am I imagining, or maybe I'm mixing up things, but did I thought I remembered a couple years back, someone had noted this discrepancy between 8th grade PSSA and the kids who were doing accelerated math, that there were some gaps in their knowledge that were being tested in the 8th grade PSSA, and that I had thought that integrated math was going to attend to some of those things, that it was going to add some 8th grade content for those kids as well. Is that not? Am I mixing up conversations?
So integrated 1, so our students actually take the algebra Keystone exam traditionally have taken it at the end of integrated 2 because those concepts are all woven in. So in 8th grade, the majority of our students are not taking the Keystone exam anymore for algebra. If you recall, the number actually went down a bunch because it is, I think it's what you're talking about, showing up skills, and it's an integrated approach at that level. So this year, actually, our students are going to take the Keystone exam in December, actually in the middle of integrated 2, because our teachers feel like that's actually when we're really finishing that Algebra 1 content. So they asked to have them assess in December for the first time, because it's 6 months before they're taking an assessment when they're finishing the content. So the middle of 2 is when they're finished up because it integrates a lot of different skills throughout 1 and then partially 2 as well. It's not just about algebra, geometry, so it's a blend. I hope I answered that.
But, all right, so for our kids in 8th grade that are taking integrated 2, they would take the algebra Keystone in December of their 8th grade year?
They're taking it at the end this year. We'll see how our results turn out. It's the first time we're taking it in December. This is the first time it'll happen during the middle of integrated 2. We're not making that adjustment in 8th grade this year. We'll see what happens. Our 8th grade have been 100% proficient the last couple of years, so we have not made that adjustment yet, but if we're successful at the high school, we'll probably adjust the 8th grade as well.
But, so that we can still have kids that would be proficient on the algebra Keystone in 8th grade, but then basic or below basic on the 8th grade PSSA.
I think we'll see as we have more kids in integrated and doing better, I think we're seeing some of that gap close because it does spiral some of those skills. The other thing that our STEM supervisors are doing are creating spiral reviews so that kids are always being brought back to the prerequisite skills.
Gotcha. Okay, it'll be interesting to see when we get the, although I guess we did just get the student level scores, right?
Yes, and I will say, because I know Mr. Lee, although not for long, I knew he was going to bring up the difficulty, and I have it here in my notes. Crosswalk NWEA math, 83%, and I didn't say it because I don't have my glasses on and I missed that note. So I'm glad you brought it up, Mr. Lee.
Thank you.
Mr. Lee is absolutely correct. The difficulty level, so there's a difficulty level, if you think of it from 0 to 1, the difficulty level of the 7th grade, the 6th and 7th grade assessment is somewhere between a 0.6 and a 0.7. The difficulty level of the 8th grade is a 1, which means that the reading level, when you look at the Lexiles, you have to be not only a good mathematician, you have to be able to fight through the language.
So this is a little bit of I think it's a pre-COVID, post-COVID, but pre-COVID, weren't our students taking the Algebra 1 Keystone? Many were taking them in 7th and 8th, and now they're taking them in 8th and 9th? Is that?
Yes, that's a correct statement. So when we transitioned to integrated, the integrated 1, 2, 3, that's when they started, that's when we moved the Keystone assessment. So that is correct. When we were in algebra, we had algebra 1, algebra 2, like that traditional path. They took it, we had, I think, I've got to go back to the numbers, but I feel like it might have been over 500 students take it in 8th grade, and then we also had some students take it in 7th grade. Now with the new sequence that we have, the majority of our kids are taking it at the high school level, but I feel like, and it's off the top of my head, but I feel like we might have, oh wait, I have it. I feel like we might have had like 200 students take it in 8th grade this past school year, around about. So we definitely have a lot less students, and then we didn't have, 7th grade was relatively non-existent.
And have we seen an improvement since that they're taking them at a later point in time? And also, this idea that 2021 should now be our, sort of this post-COVID 2021 should be our baseline, feels icky? Right? Right? Because I feel like there's there was a sense that with learning loss through COVID, the question I have is that idea of a learning loss real? Like, is it, and if we're not going to look at anything prior to 2020, is the comparison off? I guess is my question. Is the comparison off? And maybe it's not. Maybe that's not necessary to look at. It just seems like we had this major event and all of a sudden we're not looking at any of the information prior to that event.
So let me clarify, we're always going to look, despite what the state says, we're always going to look back, right? Because I think it's important, right? You can't pretend that 19 and 18 and 17 didn't happen, right? So we're still going to look. I think typically when we look at least recent trends, we're looking at 3 years worth of data, but we'll always look back to really since the standards change, which was 2015 was when the standards changed. So really that's the look back period.
Thank you.
Oh, well, and also, there's an important, in my perspective, there's an importance of using 2021 as the baseline so that we're not setting a higher bar than the current place our students are now because of the learning loss. So having an accurate assessment of where we are as a district, acknowledging where we might have been before, but then putting in place anything we need to moving forward from the data.
And I think as we move throughout the year and we do future data presentations, this is state assessment data. What are kids doing on their local assessments and what does their day-to-day performance? Then we can start to triangulate, right? Because this is just a sliver of kids' story, right? We're not making high stakes decisions. This is just a sliver. But because it's public facing, it feels like it's bigger than a sliver.
Dr. McGloin, I'm going to address this question to you because I'd asked this about a year ago, and this is going back many administrations, but I do remember this number where we had 66% of the district receiving outside enrichment and or tutoring. And last year you said that you were going to find out what we were doing now, currently, how many students are receiving that? Because I think that that is significant when we're looking at this data.
Right. So I'm not 100% certain how many students are receiving outside tutoring. We did tutor our students last year in the district at the elementary level, also at the middle level and the high school. We provided tutoring for students across all grade levels last year as a district after school. We transitioned the middle school program a little last year and ran it a little different after school a few days a week where we could have a group of kids, not one-to-one, so that we could get more students through the program. So we did make a transition to try to get more students participating in the program at the middle and the high school level. So we did run a lot of tutoring last year as a district, but the actual number of how many students or a percent of students that are tutored is a really hard figure for us to get a grasp on.
I appreciate that we're doing some internal tutoring, but when I drive by Kumon and Mathnasium and H24, these parking lots are full, and they're full with a lot of students that are in the district. So how can we ascertain that information of, approximately how many people are spending an additional $3, $4, $5, $1,000 a month for, enrichment and or private tutoring?
I wonder, I don't remember specifically, but I wonder if that data came from the Challenge Success Survey? And I know that there's been talk about not necessarily doing that same survey, but doing something similar, and whether that could be a piece of that as well.
It may have. In January, I'm going to be doing a state of the district and looking at the progress we're making towards meeting or exceeding our goals and all forward. And as a result of that, we're going to be doing a community survey. We can absolutely put a question in there. I mean, well, the data will only be as good as the number of people who respond to it, but it will give us some sort of understanding of what percentage of students might be partaking in outside tutoring.
Okay, I'll try to keep it brief. I'm going to do it this time. So you talked about second chance learning, and we talked about, a big key to that, also what Kimberly's addressing now is time and exposure, looking at that over and over again. So I guess the question I have is, where are we going to intentionally change our practice in the schools, or our school day, or our school kindergarten, full day kindergarten, for example, but also high school. And you talked about lunch and learn. It's great, but the students have to go to it and have to set it up, where WIN is already set up for them. But that's tutoring at the school level, where you're going over what you did wrong, how you can improve, and that's what really helps move the needle. So around that thought of second chance learning, where are we seeing that across our district practices?
So obviously much easier at the elementary because you have kids all day long. Middle school, you're on a team. One of the things that we're going to do is a think tank with our high school administrators and some teachers to see how we can use what I call our real estate. So here's the day. How do we achieve this in the day? Do we think of advisory a little bit differently? Do we think of lunch and learn maybe at certain times differently? All to be determined, and we'll come back and we'll share that. But that really is where the rubber meets the road. And also making sure that if you're in 7th grade, but you're not performing math at a 7th grade level, you're performing at a 4th grade, that you're working on those prerequisite skills that get you ready for, right? So the state has something called the vertical viewer, where the standard back maps all the way to kindergarten. We need to be able to make sure that we can draw that line between here's what is being taught in 7th grade and here's what I'm learning, so that you're at least on the trajectory to understand the concept. Because when we put kids in completely different programs, we never get kids back on instructional core. Once they're off, they never get back on.
And thank you. You started this with, we can't be a deficit thinking, we can't have deficit thinking in our district. And we really haven't heard that clearly stated. And we can see it in the presentation. And the difference between CCOB and this presentation is about that kind of theory of practice, what we believe in our values, and how it affects our teachers and our students. But it was also echoed so positively in the equity committee and around like negativity thinking and how our bias doesn't really move us forward as a community as well. So thank you for kind of wrapping that in. We have to think about not just keeping kids in boxes and where they can achieve, and that means a tall, like really low ceilings as well.
And the good news is people are committed to that work here. That's a really heavy lift in some places that I've worked before, but people are committed to that work here in Lower Merion. And so it's just giving them permission and empowering them to.
Just using your example, if you have a 7th grader and they're doing math on a 4th grade level, then we have failed that student. I mean, how many students do we have in that category?
So I'm talking about a student that has a specific learning disability in math.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm talking about kids that have specific math struggles.
Okay.
Ms. Schaffmeister?
You go ahead. I'll go.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate your presentation too. It's like, it's for looking at how can we do better rather than, pull the kids up. But I was wondering, we talked a lot about math, and I wanted to go back to language, because I did notice special ed was pretty low on the ELA, and I'm wondering with that, because you mentioned about the thinking response versus the understand, and And I was wondering, how much is that going back to a foundation of understanding of grammar? Because the complaints I've heard from students is like, I get feedback back, and it's not concrete like you can with math, but they don't really understand what the teacher's telling them is that they need to correct. And I wondered, how much is it, how they can do that better?
So that's something, I mentioned I had stopped in a couple curriculum days. Dr. Martin Patone was working on structures of the English language and conventions, being intentional about where that's going to go in each grade level, because kids need to be able not to just put their thoughts on paper, but to be coherent in what they're writing. When I look at our special education data and I look at our ELA scores, the students that are struggling the most are kids with significant specific learning disability in reading, that they're reading far below grade level, or they have a disability in written expression. And so it's the unlocking of the actual writing. So that's where we have to think differently about supporting some kids. How do we unlock that? And how do we continue to model what it is that kids need to do so that we can accelerate them along?
Okay, I kind of want to go back to the beginning of your presentation where you said something and it sort of stuck in my mind and I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you were talking about specifically the achievement gap with our Black and African American students. And you were talking about just increasing the amount that we were giving to all of our students and sort of a rising tide raises all boats. And while it's absolutely true, what I'm concerned about is that would just sort of raise the gap up, that doesn't close the gap, it just changes the placement of the gap. And so I'd really love to hear a little bit more about if I'm interpreting that correctly, if, like why you feel that way, and what we're doing, what you think we should be doing differently specifically to address that, because obviously we've been working on it for a long time. Everybody's working on it a long time. It is not an easy problem to do,
And I just want to be clear, when I'm looking at achievement gaps, I'm not just looking at one subgroup of kids, I'm looking at all of our subgroups. And there is that risk that when you get everyone to improve at the same rate, you just keep the gap, but you just move it. The reason that we need to look at our common assessments and be more focused and targeted, there are kids that are obviously missing some part of the instruction that we're giving them. And if we don't have a really good assessment system in place that we can pinpoint that, we're not able to help change their trajectory, right? So one of the things that the district has done is put foundations in K-1-2.
Right.
That fundamentally is going to change the trajectory there around structured literacy. What we have to make sure, though, is that when kids go to third grade, if they're still struggling with phonics and phonemic awareness, that we don't stop giving them that instruction, that we have the ability to continue that, right? Or that we have the ability to work with small groups of students that might have skill gaps or skill deficits so that we close those gaps in earlier grade levels, so that as kids matriculate to the middle school and the high school, we're not still dealing with the same skill gaps.
So basically it's a drilling in on the level 1 and the level 2 on MTSS, really strengthening our, I sort of, in my brain, I think of it like a rubric for behavior that our professional staff is doing, like, okay, I have this, I have this, I have this, I have this situation, then I do that. That's 10%
So we
of
have
how
to
I
look
address
at
this
like
issue.
how, like across elementaries, how do our 6 elementary schools perform? Then how does each one perform? Then how does that grade level perform? How does the classroom perform? How does the student perform?
Right.
So again, name students' name, strength and need, so that we can get at any type of struggle kids have as early as possible.
I mean, and listening to you say that and thinking about the way my kid in elementary school and her friends function, I think maybe even inviting our students to identify their strength and need with their, like as part of a classroom activity with their teacher really can help build that confidence and self-esteem as someone who didn't go directly into a STEM field because no one ever told me that I could be good at English and at biology. That like having that opportunity to say, yes, I'm very good at this, and also I need help in that, and you can sort of see that relating to other kids in your class can sort of also help destigmatize it while making it a thing that's just sort of part of everybody's practice.
And as we develop the Lower Merion learning model, those are the types of things that are going to be in it. Conferring with kids, getting them to identify where their strengths and areas of opportunity are, right? Because it's metacognition, learner seeing themselves.
Yeah, and I think framing it as area of opportunity and need as opposed to weakness.
Right.
Like we always think of those two as balanced, and nobody wants to talk
No.
about their weaknesses.
No, that's why you'll always hear me call it an area of opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that's a real good sort of thing that we can, terminology, we can bring, verbiage, we can bring down to our students. Thank you.
Mr. Fetterman?
Thank you. Dr. Yanni, just a more broader question in following up on Shayna's earlier question about test-taking ability and whether these PSSAs or the Keystones, whether they fundamentally accurately measure academic performance or what they're trying to measure, and whether there's built in to the whole testing any type of bias to begin with. And so, and the second part, or third part of that question is, to what extent is our curriculum focused on the test taking? And does that coincide with our overall curriculum goals, if you understand what I'm saying?
So the reason we have to look at more than just state assessments, we have to triangulate how kids do. So how do they do on these assessments? How do they do on classroom assessments? How do they do on a daily basis? That helps us understand their performance. There is inherent bias in all of these assessments. None of these assessments are bias-free, right? And so that is another thing. Unfortunately, this is how we're judged by the state. So we have to go into looking at, into the process of looking at results, knowing that there are some things that are outside of our control.
What's the other question? I'm looking at the chart. You all right? Who are the historically underperforming? Who is that group, and who are the economically disadvantaged people? Who are that?
So there's intersectionality. So students can be part of more than one group.
Okay,
So historically underperforming would be sometimes our minority students, it would be sometimes our special education students, it could be our English language learners. There's a lot of intersectionality. So kids can be part of more than one subgroup.
okay. 'Cause
Economically disadvantaged would be those students that qualify for free or reduced lunch.
Okay,
And those are state
Yes.
defined groups.
Yeah, state-defined groups.
So it's-
and you can't, even with the historically underperforming, break it down into demographics? Because I think that will tell us something else additional.
Yes and no. We can do it. It's a tedious process because we don't always get we don't get that level of state report from the state. We're limited on what we get, but that is something that we're digging into, because if there are kids that are double counted or triple counted across subgroups, that also skews the results.
Right, right, because what tends to happen is people automatically, as a default, say, oh, Black and African American, well, those are the historically underperforming or the economically disadvantaged as a group, and that's why I think we should disaggregate that data as well, so people can really see what we're talking about.
Do we have any more follow-up questions? Thank you very much. As we move along our agenda, we have no added agenda items for the evening, so we'll move to audience recognition. At this time, I should actually start by saying thank you. Take a step back, move on. So at this time, the chat feature will be open and you'll see a 10-minute timer appear on your screen. You can submit your comments and or questions via the chat feature if you are at home watching this presentation. Please be sure to begin with your full name and where you reside within the district in order for your comment to be shared. That is true for both in-person comments and online comments. Ms. LaPera, do we have?
Old Faithful. Ruth Schenken, Winwood. Remember the days when we didn't take these tests? We just graduated? Or the school teacher gave us a report card and that's what counted? First, I have first thing I want to talk about is Oakwell, my little Lorax thing here. Stewards of the earth is what we want our students and our people to be, not destroyers of a wonderful ecosystem. And to destroy this ecosystem to afford a few students to play some sports as opposed to thousands of people who would enjoy this property. Number two, lights on Arnold Field, destroying the night sky and the migrating birds, again for sports, which can be played in the daylight as it has been forever. Number three, the time change for high school students who won't go to sleep any earlier and won't sleep any later. They'll just spend more time on their screens. And who will help them when they get to college, and who's going to make time changes for that? And all of these things cause us to neglect the full-day kindergarten because we say we have to do this and we have to do that and we have to do that and we only have enough money for these few items. When you talk about the achievement gap, you're forgetting about full-day kindergarten. These are the students who do not go to pre-K, they do not go to private kindergarten, they go to babysitters, and they miss out on the colors and the letters and the name and writing. And when you really want to close that achievement gap, you need to put in full-day kindergarten. The 3 hours a day is not enough. There's no lunch, there's no playtime, there's no special attention to any kind of issues that are going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jenkins.
And that's all I have for in-person comments. Buckley, I'm sorry.
While we're waiting for the clock to run out, let me respond to a couple of things. So Oakwell, I had promised at a previous meeting that when we have an update to give on Oakwell, we will do it. We're not doing anything behind the scenes, you know. So when we have an update, there will be an update, and we will make sure that that update gets out there loud and proud, out for the entire community to hear. Arnold Field and the lights. I jokingly said to a few board members, I've talked more about fields in 3 months. It's 3 months tomorrow, by the way. Thanks, you can tell me happy anniversary. 90 days, 90 days, I get my, you know, maybe they'll have to be back for 91, but I'm not sure. Lights on Arnold Field, if we get to the point of having lights on Arnold Field, there will absolutely be restrictions about when those lights can be on and when those lights can't be on. So it's not, you know, I think there's a belief out there that we're going to have lights on 24/7 and that it's going to disturb everybody every single night. As a superintendent that just had to replace lights last year, I can tell you that the new lights are fundamentally different than the old lights. The time change, we're moving forward with that. Whether it impacts kids beyond K-12, I don't know, but we're going to do some pre and post survey data to see what kids' sleep hygiene habits are now, and then we'll do it again next year so that we can see if there's any change. And I can tell you, no one's neglecting full-day kindergarten. We have been working on a number of things to make sure that barriers that exist to student performance are changed so that, you know, we don't let things stand in our way. I will tell you that we do have extended day kindergarten. I know it's not universal full-day kindergarten, and I don't want anyone to mistake that I'm saying that that replaces the need for full-day kindergarten. But there is full-day kindergarten, or there's full-day programming for kids that need it right now. One thing I will say, when we think about achievement gap is affected, yes, by early intervention, but we also see achievement gaps start to widen once kids are done with fourth grade. So, having a longer day in kindergarten might be one strategy to improve that, but it's not going to be the only strategy that we have to look at that achievement gap year over year.
Thank you, Dr. Yanni. Ms. Buckman, I know we still have a few minutes left if people are still typing, but do we have any online comments yet?
Yes, we have two comments in the chat. The first is from Catherine Kurtz of Narberth. She writes, I am very concerned that the board take another hard look at Oakwell and save it as historically and ecologically for all residents. Please act for the sake of all of us to preserve this special place. The next comment is from Michelle McGill of Ballackinwood. Lower Merion School District has a superintendent. This is what leadership looks like. Finally, someone understands that we should not be focused on student problem areas. Do we have any updates on the student recommendation process for the 8th grade? I am under the impression that we are designing a new plan for this school year. This process continues to be problematic for many students.
I think I've said enough about Oakwell for this evening. Regarding rostering classes, we need to make sure that all of our processes for rostering students from one grade level to the next or one course to the next are objective. And so we're going to need to continue to take a look at that, because we're not going to serve students well if our processes aren't as objective as possible. So that's why we have to triangulate some data. How do kids do on assessments? How do they do on day-to-day work? And then also, ultimately, if a student is placed in a class or recommended for a class and the parent or guardian caregiver wants a student to be in a more rigorous class, parents have that right. And so we have to make that process more overt and more clear.
We have about 2 more minutes left, so we will wait until our time is up. Ms. Buckman, were there any additional? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Kimberly's finished with this.
I'll end the meeting with upcoming meeting dates. This Thursday, November 16th, the Facilities and Purchasing Committee meeting at 8:30 a.m. here in the DAO. Next Monday night, November 20th, is the regular business board meeting, again, here in the DAO at 8 p.m. On Wednesday, November 29th, is the every other month Communications Committee meeting, which will be at 7 p.m. via Zoom. Upcoming events this week include the Lmsb Student Services Gifted 101 program, that's via Zoom tomorrow at 6:30, and a second parent education series program on study skills and organization, which is via Zoom the following evening at 7 p.m. For any theater lovers out there, both of our high schools have great productions going on this year, this weekend specifically. Harrington Theater Company is doing The Importance of Being Earnest, and LM Players are doing The Little Shop of Horrors, so I encourage you all to spend your weekend watching theater. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.